The massive chamber stretched out like a cathedral of metal and glass, with lights from 1,000 worlds reflected in its polished floors. Ambassador Daniel Wright stood at the human podium, his hands gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Around him sat representatives from 43 different alien species, each one looking down at him with expressions that ranged from bored indifference to outright contempt. 3 months had passed since the talks began, and every single day had been an exercise in humiliation. The Zareth representative, a creature called Vexthor that stood nearly 8 feet tall with dark blue exoskeleton and mandibles that clicked when he spoke, rose from his seat. His voice boomed through the translation devices that every delegate wore. The sound came out in perfect English, but the tone carried unmistakable arrogance. Daniel had learned to recognize that tone over the past 90 days. It was the sound of someone who believed they were speaking to a particularly slow child. Vexthor's proposal was simple in its cruelty. Humanity would surrender control of its outer colonies to Council oversight. Earth's military fleet would be reduced to 15 patrol vessels, just enough to handle pirates but nowhere near enough to defend against a real threat. Human faster-than-light technology would be handed over to Council scientists for study and regulation. In exchange, humanity would receive the Council's protection and guidance as they matured into a proper spacefaring civilization. Daniel listened to every word without interruption. That was what diplomats did. They listened, they considered, they responded with measured calm. But inside, a fire was building that had nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with the survival of his species. The Council thought they were offering humanity a gift. What they were actually demanding was complete and total submission. From the observation deck above the main chamber, Captain Lisa Morgan watched the proceedings with growing anger. She commanded the Valiant, one of humanity's diplomatic escort vessels, and her orders were clear. Protect the ambassador, maintain the peace, and under no circumstances start an international incident. Those orders were becoming harder to follow with each passing hour. She could see Daniel's posture, the way his shoulders had gone rigid, and she knew he was reaching his limit. Lisa had served in the Earth Defense Force for 20 years. She had fought pirates in the Outer Rim, escorted colony ships through dangerous space, and once held off a Kryn raiding party for 6 hours with nothing but a damaged frigate and pure stubborn determination. She knew what humanity was capable of when pushed. The Council had no idea what they were poking with their ultimatums and demands. The chamber fell silent as Vexthor finished his speech. Other delegates murmured their agreement, some more enthusiastic than others. The Thalak representative seemed uncomfortable with the harsh terms but said nothing. The Meridian Collective's ambassador actually looked sympathetic, but she too remained quiet. Unity among Council members was expected, even when some privately disagreed. Daniel cleared his throat and activated his microphone. Every eye in the chamber turned toward him. He could feel the weight of their attention, the expectation that he would argue, negotiate, perhaps beg for better terms. That was what younger species did when faced with Council demands. They pleaded for mercy and accepted whatever scraps were offered. Instead, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small communication device. It was Earth technology, more advanced than anything the Council used, though they didn't know that. He pressed a button and waited for the connection to establish. The signal traveled faster than light across the vast distance between Harmony 7 Station and Earth, reaching the office of President Helen Clark in less than 3 seconds. The conversation was brief. Daniel explained the Council's final offer in clear, simple terms. President Clark's response was equally direct. Daniel nodded once, thanked her, and ended the call. The entire exchange took less than 2 minutes. When he looked up at the assembled delegates, his expression had changed. The careful diplomatic mask had fallen away, replaced by something the Council members had never seen on a human face before. Determination mixed with barely controlled fury. Daniel spoke slowly and clearly, making sure every word was translated perfectly. He thanked the Council for their time and consideration. He acknowledged their concern for humanity's well-being. Then he delivered the message that would change everything. Humanity respectfully declined the Council's offer. Furthermore, humanity was withdrawing from these peace talks immediately and recalling all diplomatic personnel from Council space. The chamber erupted into chaos. Vexthor's mandibles clacked so rapidly it sounded like gunfire. He demanded to know if humanity understood what they were doing. The Council's protection was not something to be casually refused. There were dangers in the galaxy that a young species could not possibly comprehend. Without the Council's guidance, humanity would stumble into disaster. Daniel let him finish. Then he smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. It was the smile of someone who had just made a decision they should have made months ago. He explained that humanity had survived and thrived for thousands of years without the Council's help. They had fought wars, built civilizations, reached for the stars, and done it all on their own. If the Council could not treat them as equals, then humanity would make their own way in the universe. The Thalok representative tried to offer a compromise. Perhaps they could revisit the terms, find some middle ground that both sides could accept. But Daniel was already packing his briefcase. He had spent 3 months watching the Council debate how best to chain humanity down. He had listened to speeches about human recklessness, human aggression, human unsuitability for independent action. He was done listening. As Daniel walked toward the exit, Vexthor made one final threat. He warned that leaving the peace talks would have consequences. The Council would not forget this insult. Species that defied the established order often found themselves facing sanctions, trade embargoes, even military intervention if they became too troublesome. Humanity should reconsider while they still had the chance. Daniel stopped at the doorway and turned back one last time. He told Vexthor and the entire Council that humanity looked forward to seeing what consequences they had in mind. Then he left, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent chamber. Lisa received the coded signal 30 seconds later. Operation Exodus was now active. Every human ship in Council space received the same message simultaneously. Return to human territory immediately. Evacuate all personnel. Leave nothing behind. The withdrawal would be total and absolute. As the Valiant's engines powered up for departure, Lisa allowed herself a grim smile. The Council thought they could intimidate humanity into submission. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between peaceful and harmless. Humanity had been peaceful. That was about to change. Admiral Kevin Hayes stood on the bridge of the Defiant, humanity's newest and most powerful warship, watching the tactical display as hundreds of green dots began moving in perfect coordination. Each dot represented a human vessel somewhere in Council space, and every single one of them was now heading home. The operation had been planned for weeks in secret, contingency protocols developed by Earth's best military minds in case the peace talks failed. Nobody had really believed they would need to use those protocols, but the planning had been thorough nonetheless. The communications officer turned in her seat and reported that all vessels had acknowledged the recall order. Merchant ships, research vessels, exploration craft, diplomatic transports, even the small pleasure yachts owned by wealthy humans who enjoyed touring alien worlds. Everyone was coming home. Kevin nodded and ordered the fleet to begin Phase 2 of the operation. Evacuation was only the first step. The second step was much more important. Commander Paul Griffin coordinated the research station withdrawals from his post aboard the science vessel Discovery. Humanity had established 17 research facilities in Council space over the past decade, studying everything from alien biology to exotic physics. Those stations contained years of accumulated data and equipment that represented billions in investment. More importantly, they contained technology that humanity had no intention of leaving behind for Council scientists to study. Paul watched his monitors as teams at each station began the systematic destruction of anything too large to evacuate. Experimental fusion reactors were overloaded and melted down into useless slag. Computer cores had their data wiped and their hardware physically shattered. Advanced sensor arrays were dismantled and their components scattered across space. Every piece of equipment that might give the Council insight into human technology was either taken or destroyed. The Council monitoring stations picked up the activity within hours. Emergency meetings were called. Representatives who had been confident and arrogant just days before now scrambled to understand what was happening. The humans weren't just leaving. They were erasing every trace of their presence with methodical efficiency. The Zareth Dominion dispatched observer ships to several human research stations, but by the time they arrived, the facilities were ready empty husks floating in space. President Helen Clark addressed Earth from the White House, her message broadcast simultaneously across every human colony and settlement. She stood behind the presidential podium wearing a dark blue suit, her expression calm but determined. She explained that humanity had sought peace with open hearts and open hands. They had offered friendship, cooperation, and mutual benefit. Instead, they had been treated like children who needed supervision and control. Helen's voice grew stronger as she continued. She reminded humanity of its history, the long, difficult climb from primitive beginnings to spacefaring civilization. Nobody had helped them reach the stars. Nobody had guided their first steps into the cosmos. Humanity had done it alone, learning from mistakes, adapting to challenges, and refusing to give up no matter how hard things became. That same spirit would carry them forward now. The message was clear and direct. Humanity would govern itself. They would make their own decisions about their future. The Council could keep their protection and their guidance. Humanity neither needed nor wanted either one. From this moment forward, human space was closed to Council vessels unless specifically invited. All trade agreements were suspended. All diplomatic relations were severed. Humanity was going home, and the Council could do whatever they wanted in their own territory. The reaction across Council space was mixed. Some species seemed relieved that the troublesome humans were removing themselves from Council politics. Others were concerned about the economic impact of losing access to human trade goods and technology. A few, particularly the Thalak and Meridians, privately regretted that things had reached this point. But the dominant voices in the Council were angry. Bexthor demanded action. The humans had insulted the Council's authority and rejected the wisdom of civilizations millions of years older than their own. Such defiance could not be allowed to stand. If humanity was permitted to simply walk away from Council jurisdiction, other species might get similar ideas. The entire carefully maintained structure of galactic society could unravel. The Zareth Dominion agreed enthusiastically. They had always viewed humanity as dangerous upstarts who needed to be controlled. Now those upstarts had openly defied the Council. Admiral Krevnal, one of the Zareth's most decorated military commanders, volunteered to lead a punitive expedition into human space. He would teach these primitives the cost of arrogance. Krevnal assembled his fleet with confidence born from centuries of Zareth military dominance. 400 warships of various classes, supported by countless smaller vessels for logistics and support. It was, by any reasonable measure, an overwhelming force. Council intelligence estimated humanity possessed perhaps 70 military vessels, most of them converted civilian craft with weapons bolted on as afterthoughts. The Zareth Armada would sweep through human space like a storm, destroying resistance and forcing Earth to accept Council terms. The Council authorized the expedition with little debate. Most representatives believed a show of force was necessary. Humanity needed to learn that defying the Council had consequences. Some voiced concerns about escalation, but they were shouted down by the majority. The humans would see the Zareth fleet, realize the futility of resistance and surrender. It would all be over quickly with minimal bloodshed. What the Council didn't know was that their intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Human military strength had been deliberately understated in all official reports. The merchant vessels that Council observers had tracked were real enough, but they were far from the whole picture. Humanity's actual military had been built in secret shipyards hidden in asteroid fields and deep space, far from prying eyes. The deception had been deliberate from the start. When humanity first made contact with the Council 15 years earlier, their military strategists had immediately recognized the need for caution. They saw how the Council treated younger species, the condescension and control disguised as protection. So they had shown the Council exactly what the Council expected to see: a small, somewhat primitive fleet suitable for a young species still learning to navigate the stars. Meanwhile, in hidden facilities throughout human space, the real fleet had been under construction. Ships incorporating lessons learned from 10,000 years of human warfare. Weapons designed by people who understood conflict at a level the peaceful Council species could barely imagine. Training programs that pushed human crews to their absolute limits and beyond. Admiral Kevin Hayes knew all of this as he watched the final evacuation transports cross back into human territory. He also knew what was coming next. Council reconnaissance had already detected the Zareth fleet mobilizing. Intelligence predicted they would cross into human space within the week. Kevin smiled without humor. Let them come. Humanity had spent 3 months being patient and diplomatic. Now it was time to remind the galaxy why humans had spent most of their history fighting each other, not because they were primitive or savage, but because they were very, very good at it. The last human civilian ship crossed the border 6 days after Daniel Wright walked out of the council chambers. Behind them, the border stations activated defensive systems that had been installed over the past 3 months. Mines that could hide from sensors until activated. Automated weapons platforms that could operate for years without maintenance. Gravity snares that could pull ships out of faster-than-light travel at precisely calculated points. The trap was set. Now humanity just had to wait for the Zareth to walk into it. Admiral Krevnal stood in the command center of his flagship, a massive vessel called the Eternal Victory that had served the Zareth Dominion for 300 years without ever facing defeat. Around him, tactical displays showed the positions of his 400 warships arranged in perfect formation. The fleet represented the largest military force assembled in council space in over a century. Krevnal felt confident that the humans would take one look at this armada and immediately surrender. The journey to human space took 5 days at maximum faster than light speed. Krevnal used the time to review intelligence reports about human military capabilities. The data showed a modest fleet of outdated vessels, inferior weapons technology, and tactical doctrine that seemed primitive compared to council standards. The reports made the humans sound like children playing at being soldiers. Krevnal felt almost disappointed that this would be so easy. Lieutenant Commander Amy Foster sat at her monitoring station 3 light years from the human border, watching her sensors with calm professionalism. She had been posted to this deep space observation platform for 6 months, and most of that time had been routine and boring. But for the past week, her job had become very interesting. Her sensors had picked up the Zareth fleet, while they were still days away from human territory. She had tracked their approach, counted their numbers, and analyzed their formation. Amy activated her communications array and sent an encrypted burst transmission to Fleet Command. The message was simple and direct. Enemy fleet detected 400 vessels, estimated time to border crossing was 18 hours. Then she settled back to wait. Her orders were clear. Observe and report, but take no action until the Zareth actually crossed into human space. Starting a war was above her pay grade. The Zareth fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel near the mining colony of New Boston, a small settlement that had been established 7 years earlier on a resource-rich asteroid. Krevnal expected to find frightened colonists and perhaps a token defense force of 1 or 2 patrol ships. Instead, his sensors showed absolutely nothing. No ships, no people, no active power signatures from the colony itself. The entire settlement had been abandoned. Krevnal felt the first stirring of unease. Why would the humans evacuate this colony? His intelligence reports had said nothing about any evacuation. He ordered his fleet to spread out and begin scanning the surrounding space. Perhaps the colonists were hiding in the asteroid field, hoping to avoid confrontation. That would be the sensible thing for a weaker species to do. The first mine detonated exactly 30 seconds after the Zareth fleet completed its deployment. The weapon had been hidden in the debris field surrounding New Boston, its power signature masked by the natural radiation of the asteroids. When it activated, its nuclear warhead released energy equivalent to a small star. 3 Zareth vessels simply ceased to exist, vaporized before their crews even knew they were under attack. Then the rest of the minefield activated. Hundreds of autonomous weapons that had been waiting silently for weeks suddenly came online. They didn't show up on Zareth sensors until the moment they fired. Nuclear explosions blossomed throughout the fleet formation like deadly flowers. Ships that had survived for centuries were torn apart in seconds. Crews that had never experienced real combat died without understanding what was happening. Krevnal watched in horror as 80 ships vanished from his tactical display in less than a minute. His communications channels filled with screaming voices and emergency transmissions. Damage reports flooded in faster than his staff could process them. This wasn't possible. The humans were supposed to be primitives with inferior technolo. Why they weren't supposed to have weapons like this. The admiral tried to restore order to his fleet. He commanded his ships to activate defensive shields and begin evasive maneuvers. But the Zareth formation had been designed for intimidation and show of force, not actual combat. The ships were bunched too close together, making them easy targets for weapons that didn't need precise aim. Nuclear explosions didn't care about armor or shields when they happened close enough. Amy watched the battle unfold on her monitors with grim satisfaction. The Zareth had walked into the trap exactly as predicted, She recorded everything for later analysis and continued tracking the enemy fleet. Her sensors picked up something new. Human ships emerging from the asteroid field behind the Zareth position. They had been hiding there for days, waiting patiently for the enemy to arrive. Captain Greg Palmer commanded the strike wing from his ship, a sleek destroyer called the Revenge. He had 19 other ships under his command, fast attack vessels designed for exactly this kind of engagement. The odds were still terrible. 20 ships against more than 300. But Greg wasn't worried about the odds. He was thinking about tactics, timing, and the element of surprise. Greg gave the order and his wing accelerated to attack speed. The human ships had been hiding using stealth technology that the Council didn't know existed. Active camouflage that bent light and sensor waves around the vessels like water flowing around stones. To Zareth sensors, the human ships had been invisible. Now they appeared seemingly out of nowhere, already at full combat speed and with weapons charging. The Zareth fleet was still reeling from the minefield attack when the human ships struck. Greg's wing hit them from behind, targeting engines and command sections with precision that came from hundreds of combat simulations. Human weapons were designed differently than Council technology. Instead of energy beams that could be deflected by shields, humans used kinetic weapons. Dense metal projectiles accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. When they hit hard. Krevenal tried to turn his fleet to face this new threat, but Zareth ships were not built for quick maneuvers. They were massive vessels designed to overwhelm enemies through size and firepower. Against a smaller, faster opponent, those advantages became liabilities. The human ships danced through the Zareth formation like sharks among whales, firing and moving before return fire could track them. The battle lasted 6 hours. It felt like 6 years to the Zareth crews who survived it. Human ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking from unexpected angles and vanishing before retaliation could be organized. The automated defense platforms continued firing throughout the engagement, forcing the Zareth to split their attention between multiple threats. Every time Krevenal thought he had established some kind of defensive perimeter, the humans would find a gap and exploit it ruthlessly. Greg lost 3 ships during the battle. Each loss hurt, but he kept his wing moving and fighting. His crews were trained for this. They had practiced these maneuvers thousands of times in simulation and hundreds of times in live exercises. The Zareth might have more ships and bigger guns, but humans had something more important: experience earned through 10,000 years of fighting each other. When the Zareth fleet finally retreated, they left behind the wreckage of more than 300 ships. Only 40 vessels managed to escape, many of them badly damaged. Krevenal was not among the survivors. His flagship had been destroyed in the final hour of battle when human bombers penetrated his defensive screen and delivered kinetic warheads directly into the ship's reactor. Court Amy recorded the retreat and transmitted her report to command. The first battle was over. Humanity had won decisively, but she knew this was just the beginning. The Council had seen their fleet destroyed. Now they would see the recordings. They would analyze the battle and realize that everything they thought they knew about humanity was wrong. The terror was just starting to spread. The news reached the Galactic Council chamber within hours of the battle's end. Vexthor stood before the assembled delegates holding a data tablet that contained information he could barely believe. The Zareth expedition had been destroyed, not defeated or damaged or forced to retreat with heavy losses. Destroyed. Of the 400 ships that had crossed into human space, only 40 had returned. Admiral Krevenal was dead along with tens of thousands of Zareth crew members. The chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives from dozens of species began shouting questions and demands. How had this happened? The humans were supposed to be weak. Their technology was supposed to be inferior. The Zareth Dominion had one of the most powerful militaries in Council space. How could primitives who had only reached the stars a few decades ago possibly defeat them so completely? Vexthor called for silence and began playing the tactical recordings that had been recovered from the surviving Zareth ships. The delegates watched in growing horror as the battle unfolded on the main display. They saw the minefield activation and the sudden appearance of human ships that seemed to materialize out of empty space. They saw weapons that moved faster than Zareth point defense systems could track. They saw human vessels maneuvering with speed and precision that shouldn't have been possible for ships of their size. Intelligence Officer Susan Blake had made sure the Council received additional information along with the battle recordings. The package included a simple message broadcast on all frequencies, where Council monitors would pick it up. The message was direct and brutal in its honesty. Humanity explained that the Council had spent centuries building their civilization on a foundation of peace and cooperation. That was admirable, but humanity had spent those same centuries fighting wars against each other. Every human nation had military traditions stretching back thousands of years. Every conflict had taught lessons written in blood. Susan's message continued with cold precision. While Council species had been exploring and trading and building cultural exchanges, humanity had been perfecting the art of killing other humans. They had learned strategy and tactics through countless battles. They had developed weapons through arms races that lasted generations. They had trained soldiers who knew nothing but war. And now the Council had decided to threaten them. That had been a mistake. The message included technical data from the Battle of New Boston. Council military analysts studied the information with growing dread. Human ships were faster than equivalent Council vessels by almost 30%. Their weapons hit harder and fired more rapidly. Their crews coordinated with precision that suggested either some form of telepathy or computer networking, far beyond anything Council technology could achieve. But what truly frightened the analysts was the final piece of data. The battle had been a test. Humanity had only deployed 15% of their actual military strength. The 20 ships that had destroyed the Zareth fleet represented a tiny fraction of Earth's defensive forces. If the Council wanted to see what humanity could really do, they were welcome to send more ships. The invitation was delivered with cold politeness that somehow made it more threatening than any angry declaration would have been. Across Council space, the reaction varied by species. The Thalak Cooperative had always been uncomfortable with the hardline approach to humanity. Now they quietly opened back-channel communications with human diplomats. The Thalak ambassador sent a private message to President Helen Clark expressing regret for how the peace talks had ended and requesting permission to establish formal relations independent of Council authority. The Meridian Collective took a different approach. Their leadership declared immediate neutrality in any conflict between humanity and the Council. Meridian ships would not participate in military actions against human territory. Meridian space would be closed to Council military vessels. The Collective had no interest in dying for Zareth pride or Council arrogance. Several smaller species quickly followed the Meridian example, but the Zareth Dominion refused to accept defeat. Their high command met an emergency session to discuss their response. They had lost more than 300 ships and one of their best admirals. Their military pride had been shattered. Their reputation throughout Council space was damaged perhaps beyond repair. The Zareth could not let this stand. If they did not respond with overwhelming force, they would be seen as weak. Other species might begin to question Zareth authority. The Zareth made their decision. They would mobilize everything they had. Every ship, every weapon, every soldier. They would throw their entire military might at humanity and crush these upstarts once and for all. If they couldn't win through superior tactics or technology, they would win through sheer numbers. Humanity might be skilled warriors, but they were still a young species with limited territory and resources. The Zareth Dominion had been building their military for centuries. Surely that had to count for something. 2,000 Zareth warships began assembling at staging points along the human border. Support vessels brought supplies and ammunition. Troop transports carried soldiers trained for boarding actions and ground combat. The Zareth were preparing not just to defeat humanity, but to occupy human territory and force Earth itself into submiss. Scion. They would make an example that the entire galaxy would remember. The Council watched these preparations with mixed feelings. Some species supported the Zareth response. Humanity needed to be taught a lesson about defying Council authority. Others were deeply concerned about escalation. A war between humanity and the Zareth could spread and destabilize the entire region. A few species began quietly reinforcing their own borders, just in case the conflict expanded beyond its current scope. Admiral Kevin Hayes received regular intelligence updates about Zareth movements and preparations. He stood in the Fleet Command Center deep beneath the surface of Mars, studying tactical projections and resource allocations. Around him, dozens of officers and analysts worked at their stations coordinating the defense of human space. The Defiant was still in orbit, but Kevin had moved his command to the more secure underground facility. This was going to be a real war, not just a border skirmish. Kevin called a meeting of his senior commanders. They gathered in a secure conference room, where holographic displays showed the current positions of both human and Zareth forces. Captain Greg Palmer was there, recently promoted after his performance at New Boston. Captain Lisa Morgan had been recalled from diplomatic duty and given command of a carrier group. Commander Paul Griffin now headed military intelligence analysis. A dozen other officers filled the remaining seats. Kevin laid out the situation in simple terms. The Zareth were coming with everything they had. 2,000 ships would cross the border within days. This time there would be no surprise, no ambush, no easy victory. The Zareth knew what they were facing now. They would be prepared and cautious. Humanity would need to meet them with full military strength and defeat them so decisively that no other council species would ever consider threatening Earth again. The planning session lasted 18 hours. Every officer contributed ideas and identified potential problems. They discussed tactics, logistics, weapons deployment, and contingency plans. By the time they finished, they had a battle plan that would either save humanity or doom it. There was no middle ground anymore. The Zareth had made this a fight for survival. Susan Blake prepared one more message for the council. This one included footage of human military facilities that had previously been kept secret. Massive shipyards in orbit around Jupiter. Training centers on Luna where soldiers practice combat in every possible environment. Weapons testing ranges in deep space where new technologies were developed and perfected. The message made it clear that what the council had seen so far was just the beginning. Susan ended her message with a simple question. Did the council really want to see what happened when humanity stopped being patient and started being serious about war? Because that was what came next. The Zareth had chosen this path. Now everyone would see where it led. In his private chambers, Vexthor watched Susan's message 3 times. Each viewing made the sick feeling in his stomach worse. He had been so certain that humanity needed council guidance and control. Now he wondered if the council had made the worst mistake in its long history. They had awakened something that should have been left alone, a species that knew war the way other species knew peace, and that species was no longer interested in talking. The Zareth fleet arrived at the Arcturus line with 2,000 warships arranged in a defensive formation that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. They had learned from the disaster at New Boston. This time they maintained proper spacing between vessels. Their sensors swept constantly for hidden mines or stealth ships. Their point defense systems were active and ready. They would not be caught unprepared again. Admiral Claire Bennett waited for them with humanity's full military fleet. 350 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect coordination, taking positions along the human side of the border. Behind them came support vessels, supply ships, medical frigates, and mobile repair stations. This was not a raiding force or a defensive ambush. This was humanity's complete military might deployed for total war. The Zareth fleet commander, an officer named Thexlar, who had been promoted after Krevnal's death, studied his tactical displays with growing unease. The human fleet was much larger than intelligence reports had suggested. More concerning was the variety of ship types he was seeing. Heavy battleships that massed more than any Zareth vessel, carriers that launched swarms of smaller attack craft, destroyers and frigates that moved with predatory grace, and something new that his sensors couldn't quite identify, massive ships that seemed to be nothing but weapons and engines. Claire stood on the bridge of her flagship, a battleship called the Indomitable, and reviewed the final battle preparations. Every ship captain knew their role. Every weapons crew had drilled their procedures until they could perform them in their sleep. Every pilot had run through combat scenarios hundreds of times. Humanity had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. Now it was time to show the galaxy what they had built. The council monitoring stations recorded everything from their distant observation posts. Representatives from every council species watched the feeds with intense attention. This battle would determine the future of galactic politics. If the Zareth won, the council's authority would be restored and humanity would be forced to accept their place as a junior species. If humanity won, everything would change. The entire structure of council power would need to be reconsidered. Thexler opened communications channels and broadcast a final demand for surrender. The Zareth Dominion offered humanity one last chance to avoid destruction. Surrender now, accept council authority, and the fleet would withdraw. Refuse and the Zareth would destroy every human military asset and occupy Earth itself. The choice was simple. Claire listened to the demand without expression. Then she opened her own communications channel and broadcast her response on all frequencies. Humanity had already given its answer when Ambassador Daniel Wright walked out of the peace talks. Nothing had changed since then. The Zareth could attack or they could go home. Those were their only options. She gave them 1 hour to decide. Thexler spent that hour making final preparations. He knew the Zareth could not back down now. Too much pride was at stake. Too much blood had already been spilled. The Dominion needed this victory to maintain its position in Council space. He gave the order to advance and the entire fleet began moving forward in careful formation. The human fleet did not wait for the Zareth to reach them. Claire gave the attack order and her ships accelerated to combat speed. The two fleets rushed toward each other across the vast emptiness of space. Weapons systems charged, shields powered up to maximum. Thousands of crew members across both sides prepared for battle, knowing that many of them would not survive the next few hours. The fleets met in a massive engagement that sprawled across cubic, light seconds of space. Zareth ships fired their energy weapons in coordinated volleys, trying to overwhelm human shields through concentrated firepower. Human ships responded with kinetic weapons and missiles that tore through Zareth armor with brutal efficiency. The mysterious new human vessels revealed their purpose as they opened. Fire with particle beam weapons that cut through enemy ships like blowtorches through paper. Colonel Nathan Price commanded the Marine forces aboard the assault carrier Freedom. His job was to repel any Zareth boarding parties and, if opportunity presented itself, to lead boarding actions against enemy vessels. The Zareth had brought troop transport specifically for ship-to-ship combat. They believed their soldiers would be superior to human Marines in close-quarters fighting. It was another assumption that would prove costly. The first Zareth boarding pods struck human ships within minutes of the battle's start. Armored soldiers poured out carrying energy weapons and expecting to overwhelm the defenders through superior numbers and equipment. Instead, they found human Marines who had trained for exactly this scenario. Nathan's troops moved through ship corridors with practiced efficiency, using cover and coordinated fire to cut down the Zareth boarders. The Zareth soldiers were well equipped and properly trained by Council standards. But Council standards were based on centuries of peace interrupted only by occasional piracy and border skirmishes. Human Marines had studied thousands of years of close-quarters combat. They knew every trick, every tactic, every way to gain advantage in confined spaces. The Zareth boarding actions failed completely within the first hour. Meanwhile, human boarding parties launched their own assaults against Zareth vessels. Nathan led one of these attacks personally, taking his best Marines through a breaching action onto a Zareth cruiser. The enemy crew fought desperately, but they had no real experience with this kind of warfare. Nathan's team captured the ship's bridge and forced a surrender within 20 minutes. The space battle raged for 3 full days. Both sides committed reserves as ships were damaged or destroyed. The Zareth tried various tactical approaches, but the humans adapted to each one with frightening speed. Human commanders seemed to anticipate Zareth moves before they happened. Human crews maintained combat effectiveness, even after suffering casualties that would have broken most Council species. On the 3rd day, the Zareth formation finally broke. Too many ships had been destroyed. Too many boarding actions had failed. The survivors were exhausted and demoralized. Thexler tried to rally his fleet, but the collapse had begun and could not be stopped. Ships began retreating individually at first, then in groups, and finally in a general withdrawal that left their slower vessels to be destroyed or captured. Claire did not pursue the fleeing Zareth beyond human borders. She had made her point. The human fleet held position, while damage control teams worked to save wounded ships and medical frigates collected escape pods from both sides. The battle was over. Humanity had won decisively. The Zareth Dominion had ceased to exist as a significant military power. Ambassador Daniel Wright returned to the Council chambers 1 week later. This time he did not come asking for anything. He came bearing an ultimatum. The chamber was much quieter than it had been during the previous talks. Many delegates could not meet his eyes. They had watched the Battle of Arcturus Line. They had seen what humanity was capable of when pushed. The terror that Vexthor and others had felt while watching those recordings had spread throughout Council space. Daniel stood at the human podium and delivered his message with calm authority. Humanity would accept peace, but only on terms of complete equality. The Council would recognize human sovereignty over all current human territory. They would respect human borders absolutely. They would treat humanity as full partners in galactic affairs, not children requiring supervision. There would be no oversight, no restrictions, no demands for technology sharing or military limitations. Bexthor rose slowly from his seat. His mandibles moved, but no sound came out at first. Finally, he found his voice and asked the question that every delegate wanted answered. What exactly was humanity? How had they become so powerful so quickly? What kind of species could fight like that? Daniel smiled, and the expression held no warmth or humor. He explained that humanity was the product of 10,000 years of constant warfare. They were born from competition and conflict. Every nation on Earth had military traditions older than some council species. Every human child learned history filled with battles and wars and struggles for survival. Humanity had come to the council seeking peace because they were tired of war. Not because they were afraid of it. Not because they were bad at it. Because they were very, very good at it and wanted something better. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper that somehow carried through the entire chamber. Humanity had shown patience and restraint for 3 months while the council debated how best to control them. That patience had limits. Those limits had been reached. Now the council had a simple choice. Accept humanity as equals and partners, or continue this conflict and see exactly what a species bred for war could really accomplish when they stopped holding back. The council voted unanimously to accept human terms that same day. Peace returned to the galaxy, but it was a fundamentally different kind of peace. The old order had been shattered. The assumption that elder species could dictate terms to younger ones had been proven false. Humanity had earned respect not through diplomacy or cultural exchange, but through superior military force. In the weeks that followed, other species began approaching humanity with offers of alliance and trade. The Thalak Cooperative established formal relations. The Meridian Collective signed mutual defense treaties. Even some former Zareth client states switched their allegiance to Earth. The balance of power in galactic politics had shifted permanently. President Helen Clark addressed humanity, one final time from the White House. She spoke of the cost of the war, the lives lost, the ships destroyed, but she also spoke of what had been gained. Humanity now stood as an equal power in galactic affairs. They had proven that youth and inexperience did not mean weakness. They had shown the galaxy that humans would not submit to unjust demands no matter how powerful the opposition seemed. The peace talks had ended in failure and insult. But from that failure had come something stronger. A humanity united and respected. A place among the stars earned through courage and skill. The council had learned that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and that patience should never be confused with fear. Humanity had left those talks in disgust. They had returned as conquerors, and the galaxy would never forget.